All right, you're live.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm Vice Mayor Shanika Smith and the Chair of the Public Safety Committee. I'd like to welcome you to our March 24th meeting. All council members and staff are participating virtually. For those of you out there today, thank you. Well, welcome, sorry. Welcome. To our audience following along, I'll state each section aloud. We are streaming live on our Virtual Engagement Hub, which is accessible through the Virtual Engagement Hub link on the front page of the city website. We also have an option for the public to listen live by phone by dialing 855-925-2801 and entering the code 9477. For today's meeting, we have the option for people to call in and comment live during the meeting. To call in and comment live, use the same number, 855-925-2801, meeting code 9477. Your phone will be muted and you will hear the meeting live. At this point, callers will hear. At this point, the callers, for you to hear, there are more options. Then you press star 3. By pressing star 3, it'll allow the callers to continue to listen live and join the speaker queue. As stated on the agenda, public comment is now heard at the beginning and the end of the meeting. All callers may comment only once during these general public comment sessions, either during the beginning or end of public comment period, but not both. We will take public comment for 30 minutes at each period. Each caller will have 3 minutes to comment. Sorry. Let me see where I am. If you're watching our meeting through the live stream, If you are watching the meeting through the live stream while you're listening to the meeting, please be sure to turn down the volume on your device before speaking. I'll go through right now and introduce all the committee members and staff who are participating virtually. Please make sure that you keep your microphone muted if you are not speaking. I'll call out each person by name. Just give us a quick hello. Councilwoman Sandra Kilgore.
Hello.
Councilwoman Kim Roney.
Good morning.
City Manager Deborah Campbell.
Hello.
City Attorney Brad Renham.
Hello.
Police Chief David Zack.
Good morning.
Fire Chief Scott Burnett.
Good morning.
Thank you all. As I just mentioned, we'll start the agenda off with public comment. Are there any callers in the speaker queue?
There's no one in the speaker queue.
Okay, that concludes this portion of our public comment. I'll move on to approval of the minutes. Can I get a motion and a second to approve the minutes?
Motion to approve, Kim Roney.
Is there a second?
Second.
All right, I'll call us each by name for approval of the minutes. Councilwoman Kilgore.
Aye.
Councilwoman Roney.
Aye.
And myself, aye. The minutes have been approved. There's only one item on our agenda today, and it's the APD after action report regarding the investigation into last summer's protest. Chief Zack is here to present those items for us today. There's no action required, but I take it that when we hear the report, we'll have further conversation amongst the committee members, and we'll decide how to move forward. Chief Zack.
Thank you, Vice Mayor Smith, members of council, City Manager Campbell, other city employees, and certainly members of our community. Good morning. I'd like to start out by saying, we've only issued this after action report covering May 29th through June 6th of 2020, the protest. We only issued this report last night. And, I just want to start off by saying that this presentation is only an introduction into what this report contains. We recognize the fact that members of council, members of public safety, our community, the media, so forth, are going to have many, many questions. So today's report is just an introduction. We know there's going to be more questions than just today. that we will probably be answering questions for weeks and months. And we are perfectly willing to do that, and we'll make ourselves available continually to satisfy the concerns of all. So I just wanted to start out by saying that, again, this is just an introduction to the report. We know it will take weeks and months to digest. And again, we're prepared to answer all questions today and moving forward into the future. This report was created at the request of City Council, and the parameters were to review the protests and the days specifically between May 29th and June 6th. Again, this is only an introduction to the report. We urge all, if you want a detailed account of the events, the challenges we faced, the lessons we learned, the report needs to be read and digested in its entirety.
It's on your slide. It says next slide.
1 second.
Slide.
Okay.
That slide.
I'm sorry, can you advance, Jenna? My apologies. Next, please. What I'd like to remind everyone is that APD has extensive experience in protest management. And this is only the second time that our crowd control team has deployed in riot gear, and the first time that our crowd control team ever deployed tear gas during a demonstration. Just a little background on the training that our crowd control team receives. They are very well trained. In 2019, we trained with FEMA, the Center for Domestic Preparedness, in preparation for the Republican National Convention. Additionally, our crowd control team members get 16 hours of in-service training per year, but there's also specialized training beyond that for commanders and munitions operators. At no point during the 9 days of protests were there more than 39 APD officers equipped with riot gear. I think there's a misconception there that we had a larger number of officers who were donning riot gear on a daily basis. Most of our officers in the field who were engaging with protesters were simply wearing their duty uniforms each and every day. So no more than 39 were ever deployed into the field at any one time. At the time of the protests on May 29th, APD had 238 sworn officers. Since the protest, 65 officers have resigned, and we currently have 177 officers available to us. Before I continue, you can advance to the next slide, Jenna. Thank you. Before I continue, I forgot to introduce some of my staff that are here with me this morning. Deputy Chief Baumstark and Deputy Chief Yelton are both joining me. Each are subject matter experts in crowd control and also munitions deployment. Some of the staff members behind me are Captain Jackie Stepp, who was incident commander virtually every day from May 29th to June 6th. And also with us is Lieutenant Joe Sorrells, who is head of our professional standards division. So I apologize for not introducing you all earlier. Also with us is Captain Silberman, who is the head of our investigative division, and Captain Mike Lamb, who also played a very pivotal role, particularly on the Bowen Street Bridge. So my apologies for not introducing them earlier. This after action report is a professional review of the incident that describes the events, highlights our lessons learned, and identifies recommendations for future events. We will be reviewing policy and practice used during the response to see if all of those policies and those standard operating procedures were followed. What this report does not do, this is not a personnel investigation. Any policy violations or standard operating procedures that were not followed are handled separately through administrative investigations that are in accordance with agency policy. Again, this report is not the end. It is only the beginning. After action reports are an opportunity to implement recommendations made based on best practices. Next, please. Between May 29th and June 6th, during the protest, there were a total of 57 arrests, resulting in 83 overall criminal charges. All of these arrests were reviewed for compliance and found to be within APD policies. Only 4 arrests required any use of force at all, and again, there were no policy violations found for those 4 arrests. Our professional standards unit received more than 500 complaints regarding the use of tear gas and anger over the destruction of supplies. We only received 1 official complaint of injury. We did investigate a second complaint of injury after learning of the incident via an article in the Asheville Citizen-Times. On November 16th, 2020, we did receive an additional 20 anonymous complaints that were submitted to us regarding various incidents of excessive force. Next, please. Within the report, there are specific areas that we did focus on and highlighted. Those are our current crowd control team tactics and training. We're addressing the Jeff Bone Bridge standoff, radio communications, mutual aid, our use of body-worn cameras, the performance of our public information office, officer presence, the destruction of the medical supply area, logistics, response to resistance and use of force, the effectiveness and proper use of munitions, and also injuries to civilians and officers. Within the report are 11 recommendations and 17 action items. Next, please. Some of the challenges that APD faced during the May and June protests. These protests, I think it goes without saying that they were unprecedented in the history of this city, but also in the history of law enforcement here and nationwide. Never before had APD encountered a protest where the emotional intensity was directed solely at police. We've never had such a prolonged deployment of this magnitude. It was the first time such a large multi-agency response, which included the National Guard, was required. This was the first time during a demonstration where our officers had to encounter firearms being discharged during a demonstration. This is the first time where we really encountered instigators who were very well organized, well equipped, wearing dark clothing, gas masks, plastic protective clothing, improvised shields, visible weapons, and using two-way radios for communication. This was not the vast majority of protesters were peaceful. That goes without saying, but there were definitely instigators with ill intent. Next, please. The APD had never experienced being repeatedly attacked with projectiles, which included mortars. Although positive dialogue occurred between officers and protesters, it was very difficult on a day-to-day basis to identify leaders and engage in positive dialogue. We were dealing with limited staffing resources due to COVID-19. As days wore on, officer fatigue became a factor, and it was also difficult to maintain adequate patrol coverage for other emergencies that were occurring throughout the city. It's the first time we dealt with widespread property damage and vandalism. It was the first time that any of our officers can recall where a march actually went on to the interstate. We were also spread very thin as there were multiple incidents occurring in the downtown area and other locations, which continually stretched our resources thin, sometimes by the hour. Next, please. This morning, I just want to address, and I don't think we could have this presentation without addressing two of the more controversial incidents that took place between the 29th and the 6th. So I want to just touch on them and take some questions because I know there are some preliminary questions, and I know there'll be questions moving forward. But I didn't feel that we could have this presentation without at least recognizing these two particular events. And the first would be what took place on the Jeff Bowen Bridge. What happened here is, we had a crowd marching towards I-240. Twice they went through lines of bicycle officers and went on to the Jeff Bowen Bridge. On the bridge, we had 23 crowd control team members who responded to assist our bicycle response team, engaging with approximately 300 protesters on the bridge. Despite multiple warnings to exit, the crowd continued to advance. Many left the bridge, but some threw objects at our crowd control team. Pepper balls and tear gas were deployed, and the standoff would eventually end when APD and group leaders were able to establish positive dialogue. Next, please. The decision to use chemical munitions is not an easy one and is not a decision that is taken lightly. So I just kind of wanted to go into a little bit of what went into that decision. Before any chemical munitions can be used, the first consideration that must be given is that there is an exit route off the bridge for those who no longer wish to be engaged, that they have a safe area to go to after warnings are given. There were multiple points of egress for those who no longer wanted to engage on the bridge to leave the area. Marching on the interstate in the bridge is extremely dangerous, not only for protesters, but for motorists and police. On the interstate, we're talking about high-speed traffic traveling in excess of 55 miles an hour. It is extremely unsafe. As the decision was being made, I told our command staff is that we will not have a Charlottesville in Asheville. And what I was referencing is that at that time was the 2017 incident in Charlottesville during the Unite the Right rally, where one person were killed and 19 more injured when a motorist drove through those protesters. In the 3 weeks following the George Floyd protest, there was across the country, there were 19 separate incidents of cars ramming into protesters. We just were not going to allow that to happen. Prior to the decision to use chemical munitions on the bridge, already we had 3 protesters and a police officer hit on I-240. We did not want to see that happen again. It was getting late and dusk, and motorist visibility was already decreasing. Another important consideration is that the Jeff Bowen Bridge is a junction for multiple interstates and emergency service access between West Asheville, downtown, and Mission Hospital. We could not risk the possibility of that junction being occupied and hindering not only police response, but medical response, fire response to West Asheville. So that was an important consideration. Another consideration, twice already, marchers had walked through and around police lines that were trying to prevent access to the interstate. Our crowd control team and our bicycle response team were greatly outnumbered. Despite multiple warnings, many protesters chose to remain on the bridge. Many left, but more remained. So those were the considerations that went in to the deployment of munitions on the Jeff Bowen Bridge. Next, please. There were mistakes. There were things we could do better. Some of the lessons learned, but not all. We are well aware that everyone on the bridge could not hear our warnings to exit and disperse. APD is now exploring better options and a better manner to communicate announcements to large crowds. That's going to take a little bit of work. Tactics evolved to better manage traffic during the demonstrations. What we learned up there is that it was extremely difficult to stop the protesters from getting onto the interstate, that it was actually easier to stop traffic, but we only learned that after what occurred on the bridge, and we were much more successful in the days and weeks that followed, it was far easier to stop traffic than it was to stop demonstrators. When warnings were being issued, and this was not just on the Jeff Bowen Bridge, but other times throughout the week, we realized that the script that officers were using to advise protesters regarding the use of munitions, the possibility of arrest, enforcement of the curfew, so forth, that script needs to be more definitive, as we want to make sure that all of our messaging is consistent. And we also realize that we need a better tracking mechanism for our crowd control munitions, and also how those are being deployed. And we've already begun addressing policy and standard operating procedures in order to make serious improvements there. Next, please. I think I'll just stop for a moment and ask if anyone has any questions thus far. Cal, continue, please. Certainly a controversy, and what I will say is nothing less than an embarrassment to the Asheville Police Department was what occurred in the alleyway between number 6 and number 10 Patton Avenue, the area known as the medical area. Our crowd control team was deployed near Pritchard Park at approximately 8 p.m. The curfew was in effect at 8 p.m., and it was the crowd controls team responsibility to now ensure that the curfew was being enforced. As the team moved toward Pack Square, they gave several curfew warnings at 8:11, 8:12, and 8:13. At 8:13, they reached the alleyway between 6 and 10 Patton Avenues and gave warnings for everyone remaining that they were in violation of the curfew. Pretty much almost everyone in that alleyway did leave, but there were a couple of persons who did need to be escorted out. No arrests were made. After clearing the alley, the highest ranking on-scene APD supervisors directed officers to destroy water bottles, first aid supplies, and food items. Next, please. Some of the intelligence that we had received prior to that evening is that that site, or not necessarily that site, but also in that general area, that instigators were being supplied with decontaminant for chemical munitions exposure, where they were resupplying with water bottles to be thrown at our officers, and quite possibly that it was a location where some of the mortars were coming from. I can say definitively no mortars were discovered in that area. On the previous night, our officers did seize in that general area spray paint, paint markers, and other items used to vandalize property, as well as water bottles and decontamination supplies. Those supplies on the previous night were just physically removed and taken out of commission. Next, please. Again, and I can't state this strongly enough, the decision to destroy those first aid supplies and food was wrong. That should not have been done. For the future demonstrations, APD will designate a property retrieval group to collect items determined necessary to be seized, to pick them up, transfer them to a secure location where they can be reclaimed later. We will also work diligently where we can prior to demonstrations to work with group leaders to identify safe areas for medical personnel. And in the subsequent days and weeks, we were able to achieve that with leaders when leaders were able to be identified. Next, please. Moving forward, again, we know there'll be many, many questions. This report will take weeks, if not months, to digest. We are prepared to answer all questions. This after-action report contains 11 recommendations and 17 action steps. Many have already been implemented. Over the next 30 days, we will be certain that there is a script for consistent messaging. Policy and standard operating procedures will be amended within the next 60 days. Administrative investigations that have identified violations will be completed within 60 days pursuant to APD policy. We will continue to assess departmental policies and best practices should more information become available. That pretty much concludes our presentation. We're now prepared to answer any questions you may have.
Chief, I have a question about agitators. You stated at the beginning that there was a small group of very organized individuals who came. They were clothed, they had uniform in their clothing and in their actions. When you have a small group of instigators who were probably trying to get a rise out of officers, how do you respond in a manner that's proportionate to the aggression, to the force, in a way that does not put all protesters or demonstrators in danger?
I think that is something not only APD struggled with, but I think law enforcement across the country struggled with. As we know, tear gas was deployed in dozens and dozens of cities across the country. A small number, is not 3 or 4. I mean, we're talking, with protests and that sometimes there were, as many as 1,000 people present at a time. These instigators were able to mingle within the crowd and conceal themselves within. So the true number isn't known, but we saw dozens and dozens of people dressed in protective gear. Mortars were being thrown from definitely different locations. When we were responding, particularly to gunfire on Haywood Avenue, where several store windows were shot out. As those officers responded, they were hit with mortars. So the true number of agitator, it's hard to come up with a definitive number. But when they're concealing themselves within the crowd, identifying them and trying to remove them becomes next to impossible, especially, you have to remember, we only had 30, 40 officers at a time in some of these locations, and in other locations, only 4 or 5. To try to wade into a crowd of 400, 500, 600 persons is impossible to do. So I think APD's learned a lot, but I think moving forward, best practices and standard operating procedures are going to attempt to identify better ways to manage that. But up until this point, those were the best practices. But I'm certain law enforcement has learned much from this, and APD will as well. And we're going to have to try to identify a better way. But again, this was the first time something like this has ever happened in the city of Asheville, and I would dare say even nationwide, of this sort of just emotion and intensity. And again, it's a learning process, but so many things had never been encountered before. And I think that is one of the primary things law enforcement is looking at, is how can you separate, or how can you identify these type of agitators. And I think you saw that in the Capitol protests as well, where it doesn't take many to create chaos. And we have to learn, law enforcement as a profession has to learn better on how to manage that.
We had a multi-agency operation. We had to call in other folk who we probably don't have, a deep working relationship with. So moving forward, how do you all train as a region in order to respond to this type of demonstration? And is that in place? I think you're muted.
In Buncombe County, prior to these protests, I don't think there's ever been a really coordinated response. Again, we've learned a lot from that, and we've already begun working with our partner agencies on how to better respond and coordinate. This was a huge problem for us when we had the multi-agency response, as far as tracking who was here, what equipment they were bringing into the field. And as we deployed them, a lot of things were happening on the fly. So we realized, when you're dealing with a multi-agency response like this, there's significant challenge. So I have already been in conversations with several chiefs in the region that we have got to kind of come up with a more unified response that has, distinct chain of command, lines of communication, but also what rules of engagement would look like. So it was a challenge. And again, we're already making adjustments because the adjustments are necessary. But we address the problems with mutual aid. Although our partners we could not have gotten through this event without them. However, again, when you have number of different agencies in the field under different command structures, under different rules, different policies, creates a huge problem communicating and deploying into the field. It's something we're already working on.
So in that same vein, how do we address improper use of force and things of that nature when we don't actually control or have personnel authority over the agency?
Again, difficult to do because some of the responding agencies don't wear body-worn cameras. They have different policies for camera activation. That's also addressed within the after-action report. But anything that APD is able to capture that might involve use of force or any misconduct would be turned over to the district attorney office. And we've done that.
Question, Chief Zach. Just wondering, now, if you can identify those instigators by the way they're dressed and the way they're communicating, whatever, then is there anything preventing you all from detaining those people to maybe, get additional information? Is there something that prevents you all from doing that?
That I think Mr. Branham might be able to help me with this one. People have the right, obviously, to exercise their First Amendment rights, and unless you identify actual, criminal behavior taking place, I don't think we have the ability to just, kind of snatch somebody up and remove them. So it's really a tight line as to when and how you can effectively do that. Brad, might you agree on that?
Yeah, Chief, I think that is a fair characterization. We try our very best, I think, to allow everyone to avail themselves of their First Amendment rights, especially in public areas such as sidewalks, public parks, that obviously is weighed against the risk of danger to anyone exercising their ability to protest within city streets or public streets or on private property. So there are some additional circumstances that we can take into account. But on public property, we always want to try to allow people to have the ability to protest and express themselves, exercise their First Amendment rights, but weigh that against the safety concerns, both for those protesting as well as other individuals within the community and public and private property when that becomes an issue as well.
So
I might add, too, that we did have some success in smaller protests that took place in the later weeks and months, not necessarily related to the Mr. Floyd protest, but other protests where we have had, people who were really agitating and sometimes carrying weapons, where we were able to get them and convince them to leave And it's much easier to do at a smaller event. But again, when we're dealing with hundreds and hundreds, it just becomes that much more difficult. And actually, and the real difficulty comes in trying to get into the crowd, because they're not going to be up front. They're going to be secreted deeply within the crowd. And then to try to get officers to wade into that crowd to reach those persons is really, really a difficult challenge.
So you would say that out of all the arrests that you had made, the 57 arrests, none of those were any of the instigators or?
I think definitely some were. We did identify one of the gunmen who was shooting on Haywood. There are active warrants for that individual. We haven't been able to take that person into custody yet. But I would definitely say some of the persons that we arrested were more aggressive than others. Others were just simply curfew violations and things of that nature. But there were several serious charges.
Okay, and out of those that were arrested, how many were not from the Asheville area? I mean, were they outsiders, or could you identify that?
What's on, Soros?
I think several of them had local addresses here in Asheville.
Yeah, there were definitely Asheville addresses. I don't know if the number would be half, Lieutenant.
Probably not quite half. No.
Not half, but definitely there were Asheville residents. But I believe, and again, I'm guessing that there were people from out of state and out of the area.
Yeah, see, that's what I was trying to identify, because a lot of times when these things happen, I hear a lot of people in the neighborhood, in the street, saying they weren't from here. They weren't from here. So that was the reason why I was questioning how many that were probably arrested or held were from out of state. And that could give us more an idea of what's really going on here.
We can definitely, I just asked if that was included in the Afton Action Report. We can make that information available for certain.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so this is Kim. Can we pull the slides back up and go back to slide 7? Is that possible? Thank you. So it was presented today that APD had never encountered a protest where the emotional intensity was directed solely at police. And I know that some of the staffing has changed, but I feel that this does a disservice to our community when there were hundreds of people that took to the streets in 2016 after the shooting of Jerry Jai Williams. There was a sit-in in the APD building. So I am concerned about a narrative that might come out to the public in this public document that doesn't tell the whole story of policing in Asheville. And then after that incident in 2016, it came out in the summer of 2018 that members of this community and organizations were, how does the article say it? Intelligence was gathered. It included Black Lives Matter groups and, according to the Citizen Times article, showing up for racial justice, as well as members of the community. So I know that that will be a concern from the public if that is happening right now. Can we go to slide 9? Does the after action report address what kind of tear gas was used in the crowd?
It does.
And then for slide 10, please. Recognizing the intent to not have another incident similar to the one in Charlottesville, was a decision made specifically to not stop traffic farther up, like perhaps near the Charlotte Street exit on 240 while protesters were in the street? Or
Yes.
on 240?
Yeah. Excuse me.
Is that addressed in the after action report?
It is, and that's exactly what happened. Once the line was walked through,
I think you muted yourself again.
yeah, no, I'm sorry. We have a number of IT issues here. After we had a line of maybe 5 or 6 bicycle officers who were on the on-ramp. Once their line was passed, we realized that we just could not start the march. So our officers were effective in getting traffic stopped, that eastbound traffic. And what happened then is the marchers reached a median and a break in the median. Then they jumped into westbound traffic where vehicles were hit with bottles and rocks and, again, people running into high-speed traffic, trying to stop that traffic. We were able to eventually stop the westbound traffic as well, but not before 3 protesters and 1 police officer were hit by a moving vehicle. Fortunately, no serious injuries there, but yeah, we did try to stop traffic. We were successful. And then in events that followed, some of the demonstrations that took place, not necessarily this week, but later, we realized that it was far easier to try to stop traffic first. But that was kind of a lesson learned that rather than try to stop the marchers, devote the resources to stopping traffic. And we were very successful doing that later on. But on this, again, this was the first time that our officers had ever encountered a protest moving on to the interstate. So it was a new situation that we had to deal with and adapt to. So we learned from it, and definitely far easier to stop traffic than it is to stop hundreds of marchers. And that's what we employed thereafter. So it's a tactic that, again, lesson learned.
And the last request I have is actually for Deborah. We got this document at 6:29 p.m. in the middle of a council meeting last night. I understood from our check-ins on Thursday that we would have the document available sooner, but a 303-page document, I really need more time to be able to review it. It is a public document, and this is a public meeting. There's public comment twice in this meeting. To be really authentic in intention, I think that we're going to, and I've made this request for the governance committee to review, but I think that we would be doing a better service to our residents and taxpayers, and also just for my needs as a council member to be able to review documents more in advance, especially one of this length and importance.
So noted, Ms. Roney, your comments and concerns are valid. Creating a 300-page document, presentation, making sure that we provided as much information about kind of summarizing the document as possible. It took us a little bit more time to prepare, but you are exactly right. We should be giving you all more time to digest. But I hope you took note of also what the chief said is this is not one and done. We can come back next month to public safety, have the same conversation, a continuing conversation over the next several months and weeks. So yes, so noted.
Thank you for hearing my concerns.
I just had one last question. It's more of an observation. There's a lot of public documentation of the protests from day one to the very end. And through that documentation, we saw videos of officers who were in really great dialogue with what appeared to be demonstration organizers. It seems like, folks just wanted to make the connection with an officer in order to share feelings and give that raw emotion. And I think that there was some progress made there, especially day one, when protesters were approaching the bridge. But once they got to the bridge, then the officers changed. The uniforms changed. We went from bike officers, and I understand that their challenges, being outnumbered and protesters being aggressive to protest. They wanted their space to demonstrate as a community. But then the riot gear, they were faced with that, the standoff. So my question to you is there consistent communication with those individuals who are trained to have that conversation, connect with organizers, give direction, relay commands? How successful was that? And is that area within the action report as a lesson learned and a way that we can advance in crowd control and crowd management?
I'm not sure if it's specifically addressed, but the interactions certainly are. And that was not the only instance where that occurred. And again, when I talk about the challenges early on, one of those challenges was identifying leaders at the outset. What we saw in many cases, a lot of in the areas, where confrontation occurred, or where the police met with the demonstrators, there wasn't always someone that you could say, this person appears to be leading the group. In the first 2 or 3 days of protest, leaders were easy to identify, and dialogue was created, and we were able to ensure the safety of all. The first night, where emotions began to get really high, even before protesters went on to the interstate, there was a moment in front of the municipal building where it was hundreds of protesters, and I believe only 3 uniformed officers. And they were able to create dialogue with those who appeared to be leaders at the front of the line. And of their own volition, those officers engaged those leaders, and the leaders asked the officers, would you kneel in solidarity with us? Not in submission, but in solidarity. And they did that, to cheers and thanks and hugs and handshakes after that. And then the crowd left the front of the municipal building. And then, a different group of leaders that appeared then took the group onto the interstate. The same thing happened with on the Bowen Bridge, where, initially there were just a lot of folks. You couldn't identify a leader, but there came a point as the crowd thinned where one of our sergeants was able to identify someone who appeared to be in charge, and he came forward, and the dialogue started, and where it could be, hey, how can we get everybody off the bridge? And then they negotiated between those groups, and then another respected community leader got involved as well. And there was dialogue where the officer addressed the crowd via bullhorn supplied by the protesters, and diffused the event and got everybody safely off the bridge, to the point where those who remained on the bridge requested a safe escort by APD back downtown. That same night, conclusion, it was roughly 2:30 in the morning. Again, it took time, but we were able to identify a leader or several leaders in the group. And our crowd control team commander was down, dressed in riot gear, speaking with that group leader. And again, the group leader said, I believe we can convince everyone to go home if you will kneel with us in solidarity. The word came up to me in the command post that, we've identified a leader who really wants to diffuse this and convince everyone to go home, and said, Chief, can we do this? And I went down there myself personally, and we did that. And within minutes, and the Citizen Times wrote an article about it, that the situation was immediately diffused. So there was success in identifying leaders. And when we were able to do that, we were able to end some very tense situations. but I think what we saw as days wore on, the crowd of leaders who were really more interested in messaging, what you saw later at night were the instigators who were there for chaos and destruction. So in some instances, we were able to effectively work with leaders. Others, it was simply impossible. And we did the best we could. In some instances, we were successful, in some we were not.
Are there any more questions from the committee? Okay.
I think more questions will be needed as we review the 303 pages.
Yeah, because I'm thinking through some things about just the way that the safest way for council to receive information, ahead of protest, and what does that tactical reporting and communication look like? How should Chief Zach report things to City Manager Campbell? And then from that point, what information is shared with us? So, we're not. I mean, I don't expect a day by day, action by action report, but just so we can get a feel of what type of force would possibly be used. Given the aggression, given the nature of the protest, and maybe some information about what is foreseen, just based on information. It's kind of hard to frame it because I know that officers, law enforcement, they receive information about protest and action that we're not privy to. So I'm just I'll think on it and figure out the best way for that reporting to be more effective and concise.
And Vice Mayor, I think there is something in the after action report regarding public information and how do we share that information. We, quite frankly, and I hope this doesn't sound irresponsible, but we literally, in some instances, in terms of communication, we had to do it on a as needed basis. Like if I were, because I was there the whole time of the protest. If I got information from the chief that things were escalating and that some more aggressive action needed to be taken, I would send via email or text to council and say, here's what I got from the chief. But that was, we were making it up as we went along during that event. And we know that we've got to get better at that. And I think what you just raised in terms of how do we formalize this process and the resources that are needed in order for us to ensure that we give you the most accurate information. So having people from not just police's communication, but other communication and engagement personnel will be necessary. And what I hope is that we don't have the really type of intense kinds of protests. We definitely want people to exercise their First Amendment rights. But I hope that we can maintain as much peace in the community as possible.
Anyone else before I move into public comment? All right, staff, is there anybody in the speaker queue?
There's no one in the speaker queue.
Oh, that's surprising. Well, we heard the information, and as the chief has already announced from the very beginning, this will be ongoing.
Vice Mayor, I'm sorry. We did have someone. It looks like they're trying to get in now. Give me 1 second.
Okay, while we're getting that together, this will be ongoing as we digest the information. I take it that the committee will come back with some direction and maybe some policy recommendations.
Okay, we did have one caller join. I'm going to bring them on now.
Good morning. This is the type of after action report we get when we're interviewing a war criminal instead of the public. Let it be abundantly clear that this is not an accurate representation of what happened. This is the police's perspective on what happened over the course of May and June. This is not the public's view of what happened. The events that occurred in that alleyway were those of war criminals. Yes, somewhere in here, Chief Zach acknowledges the decision to destroy first aid supplies and food was wrong. It's incredible how someone in a position of power like that can get away with just saying it was wrong. Acknowledging that war crimes were committed, acknowledging that they're wrong and just walk away from it. While people who were out protesting for the sake of Black lives and protesting for social justice were shot in the face, had their face broken. I treated a cracked skull. There are people who lost their sight. There are people who had femoral lacerations. There are people who were sick for days with chemical poisoning from chemical weapons shot at them by our own city. And they excuse that kind of treatment of the people away. They excuse it away with a single line that says, oh yeah, that part was wrong. With the rest of this, we would do it again. They would do this again. If you do not stop them, these war criminals will do this again to us. This is not their place. It is not their right. No one asked. I know it seems like a silly thing to say, but no one asked for things that break the Geneva Convention, chemical weapons, and destruction of medical supplies to be done in the streets of our city. Which side are you on? Please choose.
Okay, we had one more caller join the queue.
Hi, this is Janet Hurley, and I'm an Asheville resident, and I've been following everything related to the situations that happened last summer and fall. And I guess I have questions that, first of all, I'm really wondering how the community is going to be able to ask the questions that Chief Zach said that the police department is open to hearing. How, what sort of process will there be for people who were there and people who were not able to be there last summer, but have just outrage and concern for our city and the use of excessive force that happened? How will they be able to really get their questions across? I also have a question about mortars. What are mortars? I had to look up a definition, and all I saw was, military equipment sending off explosive devices, and I had not heard about this happening from within the protesting crowd. So I wondered what the definition of a mortar is. I also feel really concerned about a narrative that came up in this meeting that focused on outside instigators or outside agitators. I feel like that's a distraction from what Asheville should be concerned about, that Asheville police deployed tear gas and pepper balls against Asheville residents, and I would encourage public safety and Asheville City Council to not get focused on outside agitators, because that is not really what we're talking about here. I'm also curious if the DA is going to review all of the body cam footage. Will he deliver a report? What does that mean exactly? And I'm also just the idea that somehow it's not okay for people to carry decontaminants in case they're sprayed by tear gas. I don't understand that. Like, it was presented as if that was somehow an indication of presumed guilt that these folks were going to do harm to the city, as well as masks that they might have worn. So I am just left with so many questions, and I thank
Caller,
the
you're
Public
at 3
Safety
minutes.
Committee for asking more and more questions. I really appreciate.
And I'm sorry, we had one more caller join. Give me 1 second. Caller ending in 0852, your line is open.
Yes, can you hear me?
We can hear
Yes.
you.
Oh, thank you. Yes, this is Jensen Gelfond. I live in West Asheville, and I'm just calling for a couple reasons here. I was very concerned when I witnessed the use of tear gas during these protests and demonstrations. I don't think that police use of tear gas at all lines up with community values that I and many people I know have. And, it ends up conflating peaceful demonstrators with people who may be causing violence or breaking the law in more severe ways. And it causes terror and fear in all of the people who are demonstrating, many of whom are doing so peacefully. And so we need to make some tough decisions as a community about whether deploying tear gas in these situations is the right thing. And it is dangerous not only for the people who inhale the tear gas, but for people who have been harmed by the canisters themselves as they fly through the air. And mostly just how it completely confuses the situation of the idea that we can protest peacefully. And so I think it's the difficult job of the police department to make the tough decisions on how to deal with individuals who are breaking the law in a severe way that would cause harm to other people, and to find ways to hold those people to account while not indiscriminately harming the people who have come to peacefully protest. This is something that the city needs to solve. And I want to be part of that solution and part of the conversation. And I appreciate that opportunity today to give my opinion. And so I also am concerned about the statement about, we will not be having another Charlottesville here in Asheville, because Charlottesville was someone choosing to run over protesters purposefully in their vehicle, a very different situation than protesters going out into a highway and shutting down that highway. And of course, the safety concerns that come along with being on a live highway. But that is a lot different from someone purposefully attempting to mow folks over, like what happened in Charlottesville. So I just feel that we should not be, again, conflating these things. And I really look forward to seeing this conversation evolve and our city take steps to protect ourselves, but also to be fair to people who are rightfully angry and protesting about inequities in our society. Thank you so much for hearing me.
That was our last caller.
All right, that's our last caller. If there are no more comments, then I'll adjourn the meeting. Have a nice day. Thank you all.
Thank you.